I have been to more weddings than I can count, and most of them blur together after enough years. The same toasts, the same first dances, the same relieved sighs when the cake is finally cut. But there is one wedding I have never been able to set down, not for a single year since, and it began with a man in a suit that did not fit him. His name was Walter Prout, and he was the bride's grandfather. I knew him only a little, the way you know the older relative who sits at the edge of things, polite, watchful, content to let the evening happen around him rather than to him. He had raised Eleanor himself from the time she was 7, after her parents were gone. Everyone at our table knew that much. What none of us knew, what I do not think even Eleanor fully knew, not until that night, was what kind of man he had been before he was simply Eleanor's grandfather. The reception was held in the ballroom of an old hotel downtown, the kind of room with gold-leafed moldings and a chandelier the size of a small car, and the groom's family had filled half of it. The Whitmores were the sort of people who arrived already knowing where the best light was, who tipped the coat check attendant with the same easy confidence they'd use to greet a senator. Eleanor's side, her grandfather, a handful of cousins, a few of us who'd known her since she waited tables to pay for nursing school, sat closer to the kitchen doors, which I don't think was an accident. I'd met Walter a few times over the years, always briefly. He came to Eleanor's nursing school graduation and stood near the back, clapping longer than anyone else when her name was called. He drove 2 hours each way for her birthday dinners and left before dessert, saying he didn't want to keep the roads waiting. He was the kind of man you could spend an entire evening near and walk away from knowing almost nothing about, except that he clearly thought the world of his granddaughter and didn't feel any particular need to say so out loud. Walter wore a brown suit. It was clean and pressed, but it was brown in a room full of black tuxedos, and I saw more than one of the Whitmore cousins glance at him, and then look away the way people do when they've decided something about you and don't want to be caught deciding it. The toasts went long. The groom's father, a heavy-set man named Foster Whitmore who ran some kind of investment firm and never once let you forget it, stood up with a glass of champagne and a smile that did not quite reach his eyes. He talked about his son's accomplishments for what felt like 10 minutes, the firm he'd be made partner at, the house they'd already bought, the life laid out for the happy couple. Then, almost as an afterthought, he turned toward our side of the room. "And of course," he said, "we should hear from the bride's family too. Eleanor's grandfather, Walter, is it?" He said the name like he was reading it off a list. "Stand up, Walter, say a few words." And here he laughed, a short laugh meant to travel. "Since you've been so quiet all evening, maybe you'd rather give us a tune instead. I hear there's a piano just sitting there going to waste." A ripple of laughter went through the Whitmore tables. It wasn't cruel exactly, not on its face, but it had the shape of cruelty, the shape of a man handing someone a microphone he expected them to fumble, just so the room could watch them fumble it. A few people clapped, the way you clap to fill a silence rather than to celebrate anything. I looked at Eleanor. She had gone very still. She was looking at her grandfather with an expression I can only describe as bracing, the look of someone who loves a person and is afraid, just for a second, that the world is about to be unkind to them in a room they can't leave. Walter stood up slowly. He buttoned his jacket, the brown jacket, the one that didn't match anything, and for a moment I thought he was going to say something gracious and small, the kind of thing older men say to smooth over a room and sit back down. That would have been the end of it. No one would have remembered it past the weekend. Instead, he walked toward the piano. It was a grand piano, the hotel's pride, pushed against the far wall and mostly used, I imagine, to hold floral arrangements during events like this one. Someone had cleared the flowers off earlier for the band's setup and never put them back. Walter pulled the bench out, sat down, and rested his hands on the closed lid for a moment, not playing, just resting them there, the way you might rest your hand on a doorframe you hadn't walked through in a long time. Foster Whitmore, still standing, gave an exaggerated little bow toward the piano, inviting more laughter, and got some. I saw Eleanor's jaw tighten. Beside me, my wife leaned over and whispered, "Oh, I hope he's all right." And I remember thinking the same thing, not hope he plays well, just hope he's all right. Hope this doesn't hurt him. Walter opened the lid. He sat for a moment longer, and the room, which had been a low murmur of cutlery and conversation, quieted the way rooms do when they sense something is about to happen, even if they don't know what. Then he lifted his hands, and he began to play. The first notes were quiet, almost too quiet. A few people near the back kept talking for a measure or two before they caught themselves. A slow, unhurried melody in a minor key, each note given its full weight before the next one arrived. I didn't recognize it at first. It had the shape of something I'd call a nocturne, though I'm no musician. It had that quality of being played in a room at night for someone who couldn't sleep. But it was the way he played it that stopped the room, more than the notes themselves. His hands didn't look like an old man's hands anymore. They moved with a fluency that seemed to come from somewhere far below conscious thought, the left hand laying down a slow, rocking foundation, the right hand singing out a melody that bent and lingered exactly where it needed to, as if he were having a quiet conversation with the piano, and the piano was answering him. Foster Whitmore's smile was still on his face, but it had stopped doing anything. It just sat there, frozen, while his eyes followed Walter's hands with the particular look of a man recalculating something. The piece built. It wasn't loud, even at its fullest. It never became the kind of crashing, chandelier-rattling performance you might expect from a film. It was something quieter and, somehow, larger. Phrase after phrase unfolding with a tenderness that made the whole grand room feel, for a few minutes, like someone's living room late at night. I found myself thinking of my own mother, of a song she used to hum while she did the dishes, though I couldn't have told you why, and when I glanced around, I saw I wasn't the only one. An older woman 2 tables over had a hand pressed flat against her chest. One of the groomsmen, a young man who'd been loudly bored all evening, had gone completely silent, his fork resting untouched against his plate. And then I looked at Eleanor. She was crying not the careful, mascara-conscious tears brides cry for photographs, but real ones falling freely, her hand pressed over her mouth. Her new husband had reached for her hand, but she wasn't looking at him. She was looking at her grandfather, and on her face was something I can only describe as recognition, as if she were watching someone she loved very much become, for a few minutes, someone she had never met. The piece reached its center and slowed. Walter let a phrase hang in the air, the way you let a held breath go, and in that pause before he resumed, Eleanor stood up. The minister, who had been quietly waiting near the head table for the signal to begin the formal vows portion of the evening. I should explain, this hotel did the toasts before the vows, an arrangement I'd never seen before or since, took a half step forward, assuming this was his cue. Eleanor lifted her hand just slightly, without taking her eyes off the piano. "Not yet," she said. Her voice wasn't loud, but the room was so quiet by then that it carried anyway. "Let him finish." And so the room waited. A bride in white on her wedding day, standing at her own reception, refusing to move forward with anything, the cake, the vows, the first dance, all of it, until an old man in a brown suit had finished playing. Walter did finish in his own time with no hurry at all. The final passage of the piece slowed further, the melody returning one last time, softer now, until it dissolved into 3 final chords, spaced out, each one allowed to ring and fade completely before the next. The last chord he simply let die away on its own. He lifted his hands from the keys before the sound had fully gone, so that for a moment the room was filled with nothing but the last trembling note and the held breath of 200 people. No one clapped right away. That's the part I remember most clearly, the silence after, which lasted just long enough to feel like its own kind of applause, before it broke into something that was not quite applause either. It was closer to a release. People were wiping their eyes. The older woman 2 tables over had both hands over her face now. And then slowly, chairs began to scrape back, and the room rose to its feet, not in the loud, whooping way a crowd rises for a band, but quietly, almost reverently, the way a congregation stands. Foster Whitmore was on his feet too. He set his champagne glass down on the table, and I watched him cross the room toward the piano, not striding, the way he'd strode earlier, but walking the way a man walks when he's not entirely sure his legs will cooperate. He stood beside the bench for a moment, and then he extended his hand to Walter and said something I was too far away to hear, but I saw Walter's face as he heard it, and I saw him nod once and take the hand. Alina reached them a moment later. She didn't say anything either. She just put her arms around her grandfather's neck and held on, and he patted her back the way you'd comfort a child, even though she was the one in the wedding dress, and he was the one who'd just done something none of us understood yet. It was Alina's aunt, sitting near us, who finally explained it quietly to the small cluster of us who'd gathered with our questions. Walter Prout had been a concert pianist once, decades ago, before a hand injury, a car accident in his 30s, had ended that life entirely. He had not played in public since. The piece he'd just performed, she told us, her voice catching, was one he had written himself, long before any of us had met him, for his wife, Alina's grandmother, who had died giving birth to Alina's mother. He had played it exactly once before, at her funeral, and never again. Not at family gatherings. Not even, as far as anyone in the family knew, alone in his own house. He played it for her tonight, the aunt said, nodding toward Alina, because tonight is the first time he's felt like he had something to give her that was really his. That dress, this room, none of that's from him. That was. I don't know what Foster Whitmore said to him at the piano, and I never asked. But I noticed, for the rest of that evening, that he sat closer to Walter than he had to anyone else, leaning in at one point to ask him something, and laughing, genuinely this time, at whatever the answer was. The brown suit didn't seem to matter anymore. Nobody at those tables glanced at it twice. When the cake was finally cut, and the first dance finally happened, Alina asked her grandfather to dance with her too, second only to her husband, and the room watched that dance with the same hush it had given the piano. He was careful with her, the way older men are careful with things they're afraid of dropping, and at one point she said something to him. I couldn't hear what, and he laughed. And for just a moment I saw what he must have looked like as a much younger man, before whatever had happened to him had happened. Later that night, as people were starting to drift toward the doors, I saw Alina sitting beside her grandfather at their table, her hand resting on top of his, neither of them saying very much. She wasn't crying anymore. She just looked, for lack of a better word, full, the way you look after you've been given something you didn't know you'd been missing. I think about that hush sometimes, about how a room full of people who had decided, without quite meaning to, that a man in a brown suit had nothing to offer them, sat in total silence and let him offer them the truest thing he had. I've seen a great many performances in my life, in concert halls that cost more than most houses, and I have never once felt what I felt in that ballroom. Not because the piece was the most technically dazzling thing I'd ever heard, but because I understood, watching him, that I was hearing something that had been silent for almost 40 years finally allowed to speak again, in front of the one person it had always been meant for.